Ladies and gentlemen, Asian guy here, I need you to stop what you're doing. I need you to put down whatever narrative you've been fed about America's debt situation and listen to me very carefully. Because what just happened in Washington isn't a policy adjustment. It isn't a budget discussion. What we witnessed this week is the moment the United States government officially admitted they have lost control of their own finances. The number that flashed across the Treasury Department's debt clock wasn't just another milestone. 38.2 trillion, but that number, that incomprehensible figure that your mind can't even process, is just the beginning of the story. What Janet Yellen said behind closed doors, what she warned the inner circle about, what she's terrified to admit publicly, is that we have crossed the line. Not the debt ceiling, not some arbitrary political boundary. We have crossed the mathematical point of no return. Let me paint you the picture that they don't want you to see. Every single day, every 24-hour period that passes, the United States government adds approximately $8 billion to this debt. Not million, billion, with a B. That's $8,000 every single day. While you're sleeping, while you're working, while you're watching Netflix. The debt machine never stops. It never takes a holiday. It never slows down. But here's where the story gets terrifying. Here's where the mathematics stop making sense and the physics of money start to break down. To service this $38 trillion debt, to just pay the interest, not reduce the principal, just service the interest payments, the U.S. government is now spending over $2 trillion annually. Let that sink in. $2 trillion just to keep the lights on, just to prevent default, just to buy one more year. Do you understand what this means? This means that more than half of every tax dollar collected, every paycheck deduction, every corporate tax payment, every penny extracted from the American economy through taxation is immediately shipped out the door to bondholders. The government collects $4 trillion in taxes, and $2 trillion of it evaporates instantly into interest payments. And this is where Janet Yellen's warning becomes absolutely chilling. Because what she knows, what she's seeing in the Treasury models, what she's afraid to say out loud, is that we are approaching the debt spiral. Not approaching, we are in it. The debt spiral is the mathematical event horizon where you borrow money to pay the interest on the money you borrowed to pay the interest on the money you borrowed before. Think about this logically. If interest payments are consuming half your tax revenue and interest rates are rising, and the debt is growing exponentially, what happens next year? What happens when interest payments become 60% of tax revenue? What happens at 70%? What happens when 100% of every dollar taxed is required just to service existing debt? The answer is simple: collapse. Mathematical, inevitable, unstoppable collapse. But here's what they're not telling you. Here's the part of the story that makes this a crisis instead of just a problem. The Federal Reserve, the entity that's supposed to be independent, the entity that's supposed to manage monetary policy for the good of the economy, has become the largest single purchaser of U.S. government debt. They are printing money to buy bonds to fund a government that can no longer fund itself. Look at the numbers that will shock you. The Fed's balance sheet has exploded from $900 billion in 2008 to over $7 trillion today. $7 trillion. That's not economic policy. That's life support. They own more than $5 trillion in government securities, which means they have created $5 trillion out of thin air to keep the government solvent. They have become the buyer of last resort for America's debt addiction. This isn't monetary policy. This is financial life support. The Fed is keeping a dead patient alive with artificial stimulus. They are the drug dealer and the U.S. government is the addict. And like all addicts, the doses keep getting bigger. Every time the government needs to roll over debt, every time they need to refinance maturing bonds, every time they need fresh cash to keep the machine running, they go to the same source: the printing press, the digital creation of dollars out of thin air, the debasement of every dollar in your pocket to fund a system that consumes more than it produces. And Janet Yellen knows this. She sees the models. She sees the projections. She knows that in 18 months, maybe 24 at the outside, the interest payments will exceed total tax collections. She knows that at that point, the only way to prevent immediate default is to print money so fast, so aggressively, so recklessly, that the dollar itself becomes the casualty. This is why her warning is alarming. Not because she's concerned about fiscal responsibility, not because she's worried about future generations. She's alarmed because she's staring at the event horizon. She's watching the United States of America approach the exact same mathematical cliff that destroyed the Weimar Republic, that bankrupted Zimbabwe, that turned the Venezuelan bolivar into toilet paper. Let me remind you how these stories end. Because history doesn't lie. In 1923, Germany needed wheelbarrows full of marks to buy bread. The government kept printing to service war debts until a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Zimbabwe followed the same playbook in 2008, printing money to fund government operations until inflation hit 231 million% annually. Venezuela is living through it right now, where a cup of coffee costs more bolivars than most people make in a month. Every single time, the pattern is identical. Unsustainable debt, printing money to service that debt, inflation explosion, currency collapse. The only difference is the timeline. Germany took 5 years, Zimbabwe took 8. Venezuela is in year 6 and counting. America is following the exact same script, page by page, chapter by chapter. The debt isn't just a number, the debt is a timer. And that timer is counting down to 0. But there's another layer to this story, another reason why this moment, this $38 trillion milestone, is different from every other debt milestone we've crossed. The world is watching. China is watching. Russia is watching. The BRICS nations, the oil producers, the central banks that have been America's creditors for decades, they're all watching. And they're starting to ask questions. Why should we continue to lend dollars to a country that prints dollars to pay us back? Why should we accept payment in a currency that's being systematically destroyed to service unpayable debt? Why should we subsidize America's spending addiction when we could demand payment in gold, in oil, in real assets that can't be printed? And here's the smoking gun that nobody is talking about. China has already started answering that question. In the last 18 months, the People's Bank of China has dumped over $300 billion in U.S. Treasury holdings. Not sold, dumped. They are quietly, systematically, methodically divesting themselves from American debt. They are building exit ramps from the dollar system while publicly maintaining diplomatic relations. The Japanese are following suit. The Saudis are diversifying. The Russians have eliminated U.S. debt from their reserves entirely. One by one, America's creditors are backing away from the table. They are refusing to double down on a losing bet. They see what Janet Yellen sees. They see the mathematics of default approaching. This coordinated exit isn't happening by accident. These central banks employ the smartest economists on the planet. They have access to the same models, the same projections, the same terrifying mathematics that keep Janet Yellen awake at night. And their conclusion is unanimous. America is approaching financial collapse. The smart money is already positioning for what comes next. Central banks are accumulating gold at record levels. They're stockpiling commodities. They're building bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. They're creating alternative payment systems like China's CIPS and Russia's SPFS. They're constructing the architecture of a post-dollar world while America drowns in debt. And here's what should terrify every American citizen. When the dollar loses its reserve currency status, when the world stops accepting dollars in exchange for real goods, when the export of inflation becomes impossible, all of that monetary debasement comes home to roost. The inflation that we exported to the world for 50 years will return like a tsunami. This is the geopolitical dimension of the debt crisis. Every dollar of debt isn't just a burden on American taxpayers. It's a weapon pointed at the heart of American power. Because power, real power, doesn't come from military strength. It comes from economic strength. It comes from having the reserve currency. It comes from being the safe haven that the world runs to in a crisis. But what happens when you become the crisis? What happens when your own debt becomes the systemic risk that threatens global financial stability? What happens when the safe haven becomes the storm? The answer is simple. The world finds a new safe haven. They create new systems. They build new rails for international trade that bypass the dollar entirely. They stop buying your debt. They stop playing your game. They leave you holding the bag. And that bag contains $38 trillion of unpayable debt. Janet Yellen's warning isn't about fiscal policy. It's about national survival. Because a country that can't pay its debts isn't a superpower. It's a client state. And the clients are getting nervous about their creditor. Here's what keeps me awake at night. Here's what should terrify every person who understands the mathematics of exponential growth. This debt didn't accumulate over centuries. This isn't the gradual buildup of a slowly declining empire. 20 trillion of this debt, more than half of the total, was added in just the last 15 years. The acceleration is vertical. The curve is parabolic. We went from $10 trillion to $20 trillion in 8 years. We went from $20 trillion to $30 trillion in 3 years. We went from $30 trillion to $38 trillion in 18 months. The pace isn't slowing, it's accelerating. And this acceleration is happening while interest rates are rising. Think about the physics of this situation. You're borrowing more money at higher rates to pay the interest on money you borrowed at lower rates. Every refinancing makes the problem bigger. Every rollover makes the burden heavier. This is compound interest working in reverse. This is the mathematical force that Einstein called the most powerful force in the universe, except now it's working against the United States Treasury instead of for it. But the truly terrifying part, the part that makes Janet Yellen's warning so urgent, is that we haven't hit the real crisis yet. Because the $38 trillion is just the official debt. It's just the money they admit to owing. It doesn't include the unfunded liabilities. It doesn't include Social Security. It doesn't include Medicare. It doesn't include the pension obligations to government employees. When you add the unfunded liabilities, when you calculate the real total obligation of the U.S. government, the number isn't $38 trillion. The number is north of $200 trillion. $200 trillion of promises that cannot mathematically be kept with an economy that generates $26 trillion in annual GDP. Social Security alone has an unfunded liability of $22 trillion. Medicare adds on another $48 trillion. State and local government pensions throw in another $15 trillion. Federal employee pensions add $7 trillion more. Every promise made, every benefit guaranteed, every check that will need to be written over the next 30 years adds up to an obligation that is 8 times larger than the entire American economy. This isn't a budgeting problem. This is a mathematical impossibility. You cannot pay 8 times your annual income in obligations, period. It cannot be done without destroying the currency. And the demographics make it worse. Every day, 10,000 baby boomers retire and begin collecting Social Security and Medicare benefits. Every day, the ratio of workers supporting retirees gets smaller. Every day, the burden on the system grows heavier. This isn't a temporary demographic shift. This is a permanent structural change that makes the unfunded liabilities grow faster than the economy that's supposed to pay for them. The trust funds are already being depleted. Social Security will be bankrupt by 2034, Medicare by 2031. When those trust funds are empty, benefits will either have to be cut by 25% or taxes will have to be raised by amounts that would destroy the economy. Neither option is politically viable, which leaves only one choice: print the money. This is why Yellen is warning. This is why the Treasury Secretary, the person who manages America's money, is sounding the alarm. She's not worried about this year's budget. She's not concerned about next year's deficit. She's terrified about the moment when the market realizes that the promises can't be kept and the math doesn't work. That moment is approaching faster than anyone wants to admit. Because every day that passes, every $8 billion that gets added to the pile, every basis point that interest rates rise, brings us one step closer to the point where the market stops believing in America's ability to pay. And when the market stops believing, when confidence breaks, when the bond buyers go on strike, the game is over. Not slowly, not gradually, overnight. The United States government will wake up one morning and discover that nobody wants to buy their debt at any price they can afford to pay. They will discover that the printing press has lost its power. They will discover that the reserve currency status that allowed them to export their inflation to the rest of the world has been revoked. And on that morning, Janet Yellen's warning will transform from a cautionary note into an obituary for the American financial empire. The line has been crossed. The $38 trillion milestone isn't just a number. It's a point of no return. And the people in charge are finally starting to realize that the mathematics of money are more powerful than the politics of denial. The question isn't whether the crisis will come. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it arrives.